Brian Fitzgerald was arrested at a few minutes past 3 o'clock, and by 5 all Melbourne was ringing with the news that the perpetrator of the famous Hansom Cab murder had been caught. The discovery that the assassin was one of the city's most fashionable young men, and the future husband of one of the richest and prettiest girls in Victoria, caused a sensation. Morn, noon and night, in two-act drawing-rooms and Melbourne clubs, the case formed the principal subject of conversation. The Fitzgeralds, my dear, an Irish family with royal blood in their veins. And this young man, who had been petted by the ladies, voted a good fellow by the men, and was universally popular, had committed a vulgar murder. It was truly shocking. What was the world coming to? As to the prisoner's guilt, everyone was certain of it. But there are those persons who, having either tender hearts or obstinate natures, deem it incumbent upon them to come forward in championship of those in trouble. There are, doubtless, those who think that Nero was a pleasant young man whose cruelties were but an overflow of high spirits, and who regard Henry VIII as a hen-pecked husband unfortunate in the possession of 6 wives. These are the people who delight in expressing their sympathy with great scoundrels of the Ned Kelly order. And therefore, even while the weight of public opinion was dead against Fitzgerald, he had his share of avowed sympathy. There was a comfort in this for Madge, not that if the whole countryside had unanimously condemned her lover, she would have believed him guilty. The element of logic does not enter into the championship of woman, and so Madge Frettlby, true woman that she was, refused to bow before any argument. He was innocent, and his innocence would be proved. Meanwhile, Brian was sitting in his cell in the Melbourne jail, thinking sadly enough about his position. He saw no hope of escape except one, and that one he did not intend to take advantage of. "It would kill her, it would kill her," he said feverishly, as he paced to and fro over the echoing stones. "Better that the last of the Fitzgeralds should perish like a common thief, than she should know the bitter truth." And throwing himself down on the bed, he covered his face with his hands. He was roused by the opening of the door of his cell, and on looking up saw that it was Duncan Colton who entered. He was a great friend of Fitzgerald's, and Brian was deeply touched by his coming to see him. "It is very kind of you," said Fitzgerald. "It's at a time like this that one appreciates friendship." "Yes, of course," answered the lawyer, fixing his keen eyes on the other's haggard face as if he would read his innermost thoughts. "But I came only partly on my own account. Frettlby asked me to see you as to your defence." "Mr. Frettlby? I thought he believed me guilty." "Will you accept me as your counsel?" "It's no good my doing so. The rope is already round my neck." "The rope is round no man's neck until he is on the scaffold. I intend to defend you whether you like it or not." "But I have no defence to make." "No defence? You're not going to confess you killed him?" "No. But there are certain circumstances which prevent me from defending myself." "What nonsense! As if any circumstances should prevent a man from saving his own life. But never mind. I like these objections. They make the nut harder to crack. Now, I want you to answer certain questions. First, where were you on the Thursday night preceding the murder?" "I can't tell you." "Oh, yes, you can, my friend. You left St. Kilda and came up to town by the 11 o'clock train." 11:20. Colton smiled in a gratified manner as he noted this down. "A little diplomacy is all that's required," he said mentally. "And where did you go then?" "Up to the Melbourne club. I played cards for a time." "When did you leave the club?" "A few minutes to 1 o'clock in the morning." "And then I suppose you went home?" "No." "Then where did you go?" "Down the street?" "Collins Street?" "Yes." "You were going to meet someone?" "I never said so." "Young men don't wander about the streets at night without some object." "I was restless and wanted to walk." "No, it won't do. You had an appointment to meet someone." "Well, yes." "Man or woman?" "I cannot tell you." "Then I must find out for myself." "You can't. Indeed? Why not? You don't know where to look for her. Her. I knew it was a woman. Now, who is she? Brian did not answer, but sat biting his lips with vexation. Come now, Fitzgerald. I know that young men will be young men, and of course you don't like these things talked about. But in this case your character must be sacrificed to save your neck. What is her name? I can't tell you. But you know it? Well, yes. And you won't tell me? No. Colton sighed and pursued another line. Were you the man who hailed the hansom? Yes, I was. The thought flashed through Colton's brain that whether the young man before him was guilty or not, things looked very black against him. Did you know it was Oliver White when you found him lying drunk in the street? No, I did not. Had I known it, I would not have picked him up. When I recognized him, I dropped him and walked away. Why? Because I detested him. Then why did you return and get into the cab with him? I did not come back. I never got into the cab. And the cabman declares that you did. He is wrong. I never came back. Then who was the man who got into the cab with White? I don't know. You have no idea? Not the least. He seems to have been dressed exactly like you. Very probably. I could name at least a dozen of my acquaintances who wear light coats over their evening dress, and soft hats. Very well. After you left White, where did you go? I can't tell you. You refuse? Yes, I do. You may have to pay a heavy price for your refusal. If necessary, I will pay it. Colton was beginning to feel annoyed. You're very foolish, he said, sacrificing your life to some feeling of false modesty. You must prove an alibi. No answer. Colton thought for a moment to consider his next move. Did you know that White carried a valuable document about? Fitzgerald hesitated and turned pale. No, I did not know. The lawyer made a masterstroke. Then why did you take it from him? What? He had it with him that night? Colton saw his advantage and seized it at once. Yes, he had it with him. Why did you take it? I did not take it. I didn't even know he had it with him. Indeed. Now will you kindly tell me what it is? Brian saw the trap into which he had fallen. No, I will not. Was it a paper of importance to you? Why do you ask? Colton fixed his keen grey eyes steadily on Brian's face. Because the man to whom that paper was of such value is the man who murdered White. Brian started up, ghastly pale. My God! It is true, after all. And he fell down on the stone floor in a dead faint. Colton, alarmed, summoned the jailer, and between them they placed Fitzgerald on the bed and dashed some cold water over his face. He recovered and moaned feebly, while Colton, seeing that he was unfit to be spoken to, left the prison. When he got outside, he stopped for a moment and looked back on the grim grey walls. Brian Fitzgerald, he said to himself, you did not commit the murder, but you know who did. Colton went down to St. Kilda to have a talk with Miss Frettlby. He had a great respect for her, and thought her a really clever woman. It was just possible, he argued, that Brian's great love might cause him to confess everything to her. He found Madge awaiting his arrival with anxiety. Colton took her hand. "Do you want to save his life?" he asked. "Save his life? God knows I would die to save him." "Pish," murmured Colton to himself, as he looked at her glowing face and outstretched hands. "These women are always in extremes." "The fact is, he is able to prove an alibi, and he refuses to do so." But why? Colton shrugged his shoulders. That is best known to himself. Some quixotic idea of honour, I fancy. Now, he refuses to tell me where he was on that night, but perhaps he won't refuse to tell you. So you must come up and see him with me, and perhaps he will recover his senses and confess. But my father, he has ordered me not to go. In that case, said Colton, rising and taking up his hat and gloves, I won't ask you. She laid her hand on his arm. Stop! Will it do any good? Colton hesitated a moment. He thought that if the reason of Brian's silence was an intrigue with a married woman, he might not tell the girl he was engaged to about it. But on the other hand, there might be some other reason, and Colton trusted to Madge to find it out. It may save his life. Then I shall go. He is more to me than my father, and if I can save him, I will. When the warder who accompanied them opened the door, they found the young man seated on his bed. He looked up, and on seeing Madge, rose and held out his hands with a cry of delight. "Brian, dear," said Madge softly, "you must tell all. For my sake." Fitzgerald sighed. This was the hardest temptation he had yet been subjected to, and he felt half inclined to yield and chance the result. But one look at Madge's pure face steeled him against doing so. What could his confession bring but sorrow and regret to one whom he loved better than his life? "Madge, you do not know what you ask." "Yes, I do," she replied quickly. "I ask you to save yourself, to prove that you are not guilty of this terrible crime, and not to sacrifice your life for the sake of... Here she stopped and looked helplessly at Colton, for she had no idea of the reason of Fitzgerald's refusal to speak. "For the sake of a woman," finished Colton bluntly. "A woman?" she faltered, still holding her lover's hand. Is that the reason?" Brian averted his eyes. "Yes." A sharp expression of anguish crossed her pale face, and sinking her head on her hands, she wept bitterly. Brian looked at her in a dogged kind of way, and Colton stared grimly at them both. "Look here, Fitzgerald," he said at length. "If you want my opinion of your conduct, I think it's infamous. Begging your pardon, Miss Frettleby, for the expression. Here is this noble girl, who loves you with her whole heart, and is ready to sacrifice everything for your sake. She comes to implore you to save your life, and you coolly turn round and acknowledge another woman." Brian lifted his head haughtily, and his face flushed. "You are wrong. There is the woman for whose sake I keep silence." And, rising up from the bed, he pointed to Madge as she sobbed bitterly on it. She lifted up her haggard face with an air of surprise. "For my sake?" "Yes, my darling. It is for your sake that I keep silence, and I shall do so though my life pays the penalty. I could tell you where I was on that night and save myself, but if I did, you would learn a secret which would curse your life, and I dare not speak. I dare not. As there is a God in heaven, I swear that I will not speak." There was a silence in the cell, broken only by Madge's convulsive sobs, and even Colton, cynical man of the world as he was, felt his eyes grow wet. Brian led Madge over to him and placed her in his arms. "Take her away," he said in a broken voice, "or I shall forget that I am a man." And turning away, he threw himself on his bed and covered his face with his hands. Colton did not answer him, but summoned the warder and tried to lead Madge away. But just as they reached the door, she broke away from him, and running back, flung herself on her lover's breast. My darling," she sobbed, kissing him, "you shall not die." And, as if afraid to trust herself longer, she ran out of the cell. Madge stepped into their cab, and Colton paused a moment to tell the cabman to drive to the railway station. Suddenly she stopped him. "Tell him to drive to Brian's lodgings in Powlett Street," she said, laying her hand on Colton's arm. "What for?" "And also to go past the Melbourne Club, as I want to stop there." "What do you intend to do?" She threw back her veil, and he was astonished to see the sudden change which had come over her. There were no tears now, and her eyes were hard and glittering, while her mouth was firmly closed. She looked like a woman who had determined to do a certain thing and would carry out her intention at whatever cost. "I intend to save Brian in spite of himself." "What do you propose to do?" "Simply this. In the first place, I may tell you that I do not understand Brian's statement that he keeps silence for my sake, as there are no secrets in my life that can justify his saying so. The facts of the case are simply these. On the night in question, Brian left our house at St. Kilda at 11 o'clock. He told me that he would call at the club to see if there were any letters for him and then go straight home. I am quite certain that he intended to do as he said. When he got to the club, he must have found a letter there which caused him to alter his mind." "From whom was the letter?" "Can't you guess? From the person, man or woman, who wanted to see him and reveal this secret about me, whatever it is. He got the letter at his club and went out to meet the writer. At the corner of the Scotch church he found Mr. White, and on recognizing him, left in disgust and walked away to keep his appointment." "And are you going to look for that letter?" "Yes. In Brian's lodgings." "He might have burnt it." "He might have done 1,000 things, but he did not. Brian is the most careless man in the world. He would put the letter into his pocket or throw it into the waste-paper basket and never think of it again." "Why do you want to stop at his club?" "To find out if any letter was waiting for him on that night." Madge waited in the cab while Colton ran up the steps of the Melbourne Club. He found a waiter with whom he was pretty well acquainted. "Look here, Brown," said the lawyer, "do you remember on that Thursday night when the Hansom Cab murder took place if any letters were waiting here for Mr. Fitzgerald?" "Well, sir," replied Brown, "there was no letter came by post, sir, but there was one brought to him on that night." "Ah," said Colton. "At what time?" "Just before 12 o'clock, sir." "Who brought it?" "A young woman, sir. A bold thing, begging your pardon, sir, and no better than she should be. She bounced in at the door as bold as brass, gives me the letter, and then she clears out before I could stop her." "You gave it to Mr. Fitzgerald, of course?" "I did, sir. He was playing cards, and he put it in his pocket after having looked at the outside of it, and went on with his game." "Didn't he open it?" "Not then, sir, but he did later on, about 1:45 o'clock. I was in the room, and he opens it and reads it. Then he says to himself, 'What damned impertinence,' and puts it back into his pocket. Then he put his coat and hat on, and walked out about 5 minutes to 1. "Ah, and he met White at 1, muttered Colton. "There's no doubt about it. The letter was an appointment, and he was going to keep it." "What kind of a letter was it?" "Very dirty, sir, in a square envelope. But the paper was good, and so was the writing." "That will do," said Colton. "I'm much obliged to you." And he hurried down to where Madge awaited him in the cab. They soon arrived at Brian's lodgings, and the door was opened by Mrs. Sampson, who looked very disconsolate indeed. The poor woman had been blaming herself severely for the information she had so unwittingly given to Inspector Gorby, and the floods of tears which she had wept had apparently had an effect on her physical condition, for her joints crackled less loudly than usual, though her voice was as shrill as ever. "That such a thing should have happened to him, and me that proud of him, not having any family of my own, except one as died and went up to heaven after his father, been carried off by a chill caused by the change from hot to cold, the weather being that contrary." They had arrived in Brian's sitting-room by this time, and Madge sank into a chair, while Colton, anxious to begin the search, hinted to Mrs. Sampson that she could go. "I'm departing, sir," piped the landlady with a sad shake of her head as she opened the door, "knowing, as I do,
as he's as innocent as an unborn babe. And to think of me having told that horrid person who had no regard for the truth, as representing himself as an insurance agent."
"What did you tell him?"
"Ah, he wanted to know if Mr. Fitzgerald always come home afore 12, which I said he was in the habit of doing, though, to be sure, he did sometimes use his latchkey."
"As he did on the night of the murder, for instance?"
"Oh, don't say that, sir. I can't take the strain of it, me being weak and ailing, though coming of a strong family, has always lived to a good age through being in the habit of wearing flannels."
"Clever man, that detective," murmured Colton to himself. "He got out of her by strategy what he never would have done by force. It's a strong piece of evidence against Fitzgerald, but it won't matter much if he can prove an alibi. You'll likely be called as a witness for the prosecution."
"Me, sir?"
squeaked Mrs. Sampson, trembling violently and thereby producing a subdued rustle as of wind in the trees.
"I've never been in the court, except the time as father took me for a treat to hear a murder, which there's no denying is as good as a play."
Colton rather impatiently opened the door for her. "Leave us for a short time, there's a good soul. Miss Frettlby and I want to rest, and we will ring for you when we are leaving."
"Oh, thank you, sir," said the lachrymose landlady, "and I hopes they won't hang him, which is such a choky way of dying. But then in life we are in death, as is well known to them as has diseases."
Here Colton, unable to restrain his impatience any longer, shut the door, and they heard Mrs. Sampson's shrill voice and subdued cracklings die away in the distance. "Now then," he said, "now that we have got rid of that woman and her tongue, where are we to begin?" "The desk," replied Madge, going over to it. "It's the most likely place." "Don't think so," said Colton, shaking his head. "If, as you say, Fitzgerald is a careless man, he would not have troubled to put it there. However, perhaps we'd better look." The desk was very untidy, just like Brian, as Madge remarked, full of paid and unpaid bills, old letters, playbills, ball programmes, and withered flowers. "Reminiscences of former flirtations," said Colton with a laugh, pointing to these.
"I should not wonder," retorted Miss Frettlby coolly. "Brian always was in love with someone or other. But you know what Lytton says? There are many counterfeits, but only one Eros. So I can afford to forget these things."
The letter, however, was not to be found in the desk, nor was it anywhere in the sitting-room. They tried the bedroom, but with no better result. Madge was about to give up the search in despair, when suddenly Colton's eye fell on the waste-paper basket, which, by some unaccountable reason, they had overlooked. The basket was half full, in fact more than half, and on looking at it a sudden thought struck the lawyer. He rang the bell, and presently Mrs. Sampson made her appearance. "How long has that waste-paper basket been standing like that?"
"It's been the only fault I had to find with him," said Mrs. Sampson. "He been that untidy that he never let me clean it out until he told me personal. He said as how he throwed things into it as he might have to look up again, and I haven't touched it for more nor 6 weeks, hoping you won't think me a bad housekeeper, it being his own wish, being fond of litter and such like."
6 weeks, repeated Colton with a look at Madge, "and he got the letter 4 weeks ago. Depend upon it, we shall find it there." Madge gave a cry, and falling on her knees, emptied the basket out on the floor. Both she and Colton were soon as busy among the fragments of paper as though they were rag-pickers.
"I hope they ain't off their heads," murmured Mrs. Sampson.
Suddenly a cry broke from Madge as she drew out of the mess a half-burnt letter written on thick and creamy-looking paper.
"At last!" she cried, rising off her knees and smoothing it out. "I knew he had not destroyed it."
"Pretty nearly, however," said Colton, as his eye glanced rapidly over it. "It's almost useless." He took it over to the window and spread it out upon the table. It was dirty and half-burnt, but still it was a clue. These are the words and portions of words which could still be discerned. July 26th. Mr. Fitzgerald is requested from a dying woman who wants to tell the bearer who will wait, Russell Street. Do not delay. "There is not much to be gained from that, I'm afraid," said Madge sadly. "It shows that he had an appointment, but who with, and where?" Colton did not answer, but leaning his head on his hands, stared hard at the paper. At last he jumped up with a cry. "I have it. Look at the paper. See how creamy and white it is. And look at the fragment of printing at the head. O.T. Villa, Toorak." "The letter was written in Toorak?" "No, it was not written in Toorak. It was written in one of the Melbourne back slums." "How do you know?" "From the waiter's description of the girl who brought it to the club. A disreputable woman, one far more likely to come from the back slums than from Toorak." "But the paper, the heading?" 3 months ago, there was a robbery at Toorak, and this is some of the paper that was stolen by the thieves." Madge said nothing, but her sparkling eyes and the nervous trembling of her hands showed her excitement. "I will see a detective this evening," said Colton exultingly. "Find out where this letter came from and who wrote it. We'll save him yet." He placed the precious letter carefully in his pocketbook. "You think that we will be able to find the woman who wrote that?" She may be dead. The letter says she is in a dying condition. However, if I can find the woman who delivered the letter at the club and who waited for Fitzgerald in Russell Street, that will be sufficient. All I want is to prove that he was not in the hansom cab with White." "And do you think you can do that?" "All depends upon this letter. I'll tell you tomorrow." Shortly afterwards they left the house, and when Colton put Madge safely into the St. Kilda train, her heart felt lighter than it had done at any time since Fitzgerald's arrest.